All right. So kind of try to get started here pretty quick today. Mention a couple things off the top. You'll have a module 5 and 6 quiz pop up after class, as well as module 7 reading. Those are both due by the end of the day on Monday. We're kind of back into that cycle. I'll also get up the next pack back assignment, which will be about the first thing that we talk about in today's class. So I'll mention that a little bit more after we cover the material. We'll take a look at it on Tuesday a little bit harder, but if you want to kind of get started on that, we'll cover the material that you would need today. It'll be similar to the last one, have some articles. I'll kind of give you some minor summaries of those articles, give you some additional prompts that you can think about responding to. Once again, I'll look a little bit harder at that, and Tuesday, the due date will be quite a bit out. But that quiz and module reading are going to be the things that you really want to focus on, okay? I think other than that, don't have anything to mention before we jump into material. Are there any questions for me? Oh, CL sessions will kind of be back up tonight and Sunday. I would highly suggest going to those. Once again, the attendance looks like it's positively correlated with both quiz and exam performance. So I've got some data to support that now, okay? Any other questions for me before we jump into material? Because we've got a lot to kind of get through here today. Okay, I don't think I forgot anything. All right, so we left off and we had introduced the idea of a price floor. So we're gonna go through this a little quick because price floors are really similar to price ceilings. Everything just gets kind of flipped on its head, right? So we said a price ceiling is effective. It says I can only charge a price this high. So the only time it was effective is if we set it below what the current price was, right? Price floors are only going to be effective. All right, the current price is $50, and I tell you you can't charge a price any lower than $30. What do you tell me? Okay, I'm not, right? Nothing happens. So the only way a price floor is binding or effective is if I set it above whatever that current equilibrium price is. Okay. Now we'll look at and see how this works in the general market first. I'm going to transition and kind of show you a minimum wage example, which is probably the best example we have of price floors. But since we haven't talked about the wage market yet, I'll kind of hold off on that. So just visually, if I have a market, right, and it's currently in equilibrium, what would consumer and producer surplus be? So the non-technical way of remembering this is consumer surplus is always the triangle on top. Producer surplus is the triangle on the bottom. Okay. So A, B, and E is consumer surplus. C, F, and D would be producers. Right? If I impose a price floor and say, look, you can't charge a price any lower than this. Well, I was. Right? The current equilibrium was lower, so things are going to change. Right? So what's going to happen? At this higher price, what's going to happen is quantity demand are going to be higher or lower if the price is higher. Lower, which sure enough, where do we hit the demand curve? A lower value. What is the quantity supplied? Well, if the price was higher, suppliers, producers would be willing to supply a lot more. So what have I created with a price floor? The quantity supplied greater than the quantity demanded at that price. I've got a surplus in the number of units. So price ceilings cause shortages in units. Price floors will create surplus in the number of units. Okay. So where is producer and consumer surplus going to be now? Well, it gets a little bit trickier. So anytime we're talking about economic surplus, so that was the surplus in the number of units. If I wanted consumer surplus, it's the difference between the consumer's what? I'm going to get tired of saying this, but I said a lot last class too. Anytime you calculate economic surplus, it's the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. Now, those are going to be different than if we're talking about consumers or producers. So for consumers, what is their marginal benefit? That's represented by the demand curve. What is their marginal cost? When you buy something, it is the price, right? So the new price, right, is going to be higher. Consumer surplus, the area in between the price that consumers now pay and their demand curve is only going to be this area A. So notice before it was that entire triangle, it's now going to be much smaller. Any questions on that? It shouldn't be too bad. You said it kind of looks similar to what we were doing last class. Now, what's going to happen to producer surplus? Well, what are the marginal benefits to producers? When I sell something, the marginal benefit is the price. So it's this new price after the price floor. What is representing the marginal cost of producers? What does supply represent? Marginal cost. So here, the area below the new price after the price floor, above marginal costs, it would be this entire area here, which we can kind of think about. It's the area of a triangle and the rectangle added together, right? Now, C and D were producer surplus before. This area of B used to be consumer surplus, but with a price floor, we've kind of transferred what used to be consumer surplus to producers. So producers will see some gain of area B. However, just like with price ceilings, what did price floors do? So even though the quantity supplied, people would like to supply more, what's the new quantity we see in the market? Well, if the price is higher, will anybody past this point choose to buy the good? No. So where does the quantity stop? Right here. Doesn't matter if people want to supply more, no one's going to buy it. So like the new equilibrium quantity after the price floor is going to be lower. So just like with price ceilings, we have a reduction in quantity. Anytime we see fewer units, what happens? All of those units used to have surplus, total surplus. If they're no longer being produced and consumed in the market, we lose that total surplus. That was our parts of the D, deadweight loss. So the number of units that we're no longer producing and consuming in the market, all of the surplus that would have existed. So when we don't talk about producers and consumers, just total surplus, that's the area in between our demand and our supply curve, or the marginal benefits and marginal cost of the entire market. So here, deadweight loss would be this kind of triangle here, right? All the total surplus loss by no longer seeing these units produced and consumed in the market. Now, I'll only ever ask you to identify what deadweight loss is, but this visual kind of lets us know what is E. That's deadweight loss that came from consumers after this deadweight loss that came from producers, right? So we can put some numbers to this. Like let's say I had a price floor. The old equilibrium price is 50. I put a price floor of 60. What was consumer surplus before the price floor? Well, it would have been the area above price, below the demand curve. So this entire triangle. So what? 40 times a half, or 800. What is it after? Well, now it's just this blue triangle. So what? 30 times a half. So we kind of notice with price floors, what's always going to happen to consumer surplus? It's going to go down. Now, producer surplus is a little tricky. It can go up or it can go down. And I'll kind of try to give you, this is only one example, so it's going to do one of two things, but I'll kind of try to explain to you why it could be the other. So what was producer surplus before? The area below the price of 50, but above the supply curve. So this is a nice, easy example, right? The area of that triangle, 40 times a half. I kind of started out with producer consumer surplus being the same. After the price floor, where is producer surplus now? The area below the price, but above supply. So I gained this rectangle here that's green, but producers lost this little red triangle. Now I try to do this to scale. So in this example, it looks like that rectangle is much larger than that little triangle. So what should have happened to producer surplus? Went up. What can happen, if I increase that price enough, just to make the most extreme case to kind of make the point, if I put the price floor at $100, what does producer surplus become? 0, right? Because I push the quantity back to 0, now nothing's sold. I could have, so it's not a guarantee that producer surplus goes up, right? If I do moderate changes to the price, like small, then likely it will. But if I make the price floor high enough, I can always decrease producer surplus, right? So in this example, what's producer surplus? Well, it's this green area. So it's the area of a rectangle. Is what, 20 times 30, plus the area of this triangle, 30 times a half. Looks like I've got what, about 1,050 here. So in this example, producer surplus did go up because that price floor wasn't that much higher than the equilibrium. Now, if I continue to increase that price floor, eventually I'll find that producer surplus also decreases. Okay. And then how would I find deadweight loss? What area is that in my graph? There's only one I haven't found. I color coded them, so it shouldn't be too tough. This red area, right? How many units were sold after the price floor? Well, people only bought 30. So these 10 units that we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market, we lost that surplus or the area between the supply and demand curve. So the area of this triangle will be what? 20 times 10 times a half or 100. Okay. So that's how we would calculate these surplus values kind of visually. That's what's going on with price floors. It's very similar to price ceilings, but everything's kind of flipped on its head. Right? Price ceilings lowered prices, so that could potentially help consumers. Price floors raised prices, so that could potentially help producers. But both of them will cause deadweight loss. In fact, just to make a point that I can get similar effects from both, what would a price ceiling be that would get me the exact same quantity and deadweight loss as the price floor of $60? So that price floor of $60 pushes my quantity to 30. What's a price ceiling that would push my quantity to 30? It looks like here would be 40 if I imposed a price ceiling here. So that would have the exact same effects on my total surplus or create the same deadweight loss. It would just be hurting the producers more than the consumers if I did it that way. So, you know, politically, which one of you thinks is probably used more often? Well, depends, right? I'm trying to it's an election year. Which one of these am I want to use? Well, this one helps producers. They're probably going to use price ceiling to help the consumers out because they vote. In off election years, who gives me money behind the scenes? You know, if I'm being cynical. Large companies. So what am I probably doing in non-election years? Using price floors. So when you think about these things kind of having similar effects, we can analyze them. I've got kind of a summary here, just when they're effective. An effective price floor has to be set above. So one way of remembering this is, when are these effective? A price floor is only effective if that old equilibrium is below it, right? So the only way it's effective is if it's below the floor. An effective price ceiling is only effective if the old equilibrium price is above it. Right? I don't know. It's, you know, memorizing, but also just kind of drawing out and thinking about what's going on. I think sometimes can help with that. So I've got this here, but I want to draw it out for you because I think it's relevant to the pack-back assignment. It's relevant to the real world. And we can put price floors in action, okay? So we haven't looked at yet what we call the labor market. So I'll give you guys a couple examples throughout the semester. So usually we have price and quantity. If I think about the quantity of labor, and an easy way to think about that is like the number of workers. You can measure it in like the number of hours worked, right, as well, but just some quantity of labor. And then the price of labor, we're going to call the wage, right? Still price quantity. We're still looking at this as though it's a market. It's just now the product is not Sharpie markers, it's workers, which sounds weird, but right, there is a market for workers. We're going to still have some supply of labor and some demand for labor. It gets a little bit weird here because everything's flipped on its head from the way that we usually view it. Who is demanding labor? Firms. So firms are no longer the producers. Who is supplying labor? All of us, right? People, the general public, right? So we can think about if we had a market in equilibrium, here would be kind of our equilibrium quantity of workers and our equilibrium wage. Okay. So when we use price floors, what's something related to workers that's a price floor? So if I tell you you can't charge a price any lower than this, so charging a price means paying workers. So if I can't, pay workers any lower, that's a minimum wage, right? Or we've talked about like there's like UBI floating. Is it UBI floating around out there? Universal Basic Income. Yeah, that's the acronym. So you know, we see price floors used in the labor market. Not only, I should say, we see them discussed, but we also definitely see them used with a minimum wage. So what's that going to do? Right? It sounds great, right? Minimum wage, universal basic income, these are all great things, right? However, if I raise the price here, what's going to happen to the demand for labor? Okay, I'm still going to want to hire all of these workers, but now past this point, the marginal benefit of these workers, remember, demand is the marginal benefit, marginal cost. is now below the price that I have to pay them. So what's going to happen is the new quantity kind of after the minimum wage is going to be lower than if we just left this labor market alone. Okay. Everybody with me up to this point? Same thing as a price floor, it's just in the labor market now. So what happened to producer and consumer surplus? Well, producer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to producers, and consumer surplus, I probably should color code these, is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers. So for the consumers, what's the marginal benefit? That's just the demand curve. What's the marginal cost of labor? It's this new higher minimum wage. So where is consumer surplus? This area up here. Now, what was it before the price floor? It would have been this entire triangle. So price floors hurt who? Consumers. In the labor market, who's the consumer of labor? Firms. So minimum wages definitely are going to hurt firms. Okay. Who are they going to help? Well, politically, what do you think minimum wages are always floated around, you know, or universal? It's trying to appease us, right? The suppliers of labor. So what should happen if a minimum wage is set correctly? It has the potential to increase producer surplus. So what are the marginal benefits to the workers? Well, that is going to be the wage that they're paid. Right? What's their marginal cost? That's represented by the supply curve. So here, what is producer surplus? It's going to be that area below the price or below the wage they're now being paid, but above their supply curve. So it looks like here, they lost a little bit of surplus here, but they gained some up here. So it has the potential that minimum wages can increase the surplus that exists for our workers, our suppliers of labor. Now, the problem is, if I kept my job, if I was one of these people, I love this minimum wage. My surplus is higher, right? However, what does this represent? This difference between the quantity of workers after the minimum wage and without it, all these people no longer have jobs, right? So yeah, if you kept your job, you probably liked the minimum wage, it increased your surplus. But overall, what happened to total surplus in the market? Total surplus went down, and the deadweight loss that came from the people that lost their jobs, they're probably not very happy about this minimum wage. Now, they might not directly be able to relate the fact that they lost their job to minimum wage, but there's plenty of people where that would be the case. Okay. So, you know, it makes, you know, just to kind of give some intuition too, if I increase the price of labor enough, if you go to like a gas station now, what do you see some of them have? Or a grocery store. You're not buying a lot of items. Do you have a cashier? No, you can do it all yourself. Right? They automate everything. So if you increase the minimum wage jobs, what happens to those minimum wage jobs? Companies start to get rid of them. They start to figure out, you know, I can actually do the same job, but pay less for an AI or technology of some kind that can do it. Right. So that's where that's kind of coming from. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? So this is just price floors in the context of our labor markets. Okay. I've got something in the slides, but I'll jump the gun a little bit. Well, yeah, I'll jump the gun since we're already here. So we said that, and I already asked the question earlier about you can get the same quantity from a price ceiling and a price floor. So we would call those price controls, right? So if I've got a market, here's the current equilibrium. No, I'm writing too fast without thinking about what I'm doing, right? We said we can use price ceilings, price floors to restrict quantity, but that's going to cause some deadweight loss. Instead of price controls, we also see sometimes the government uses quantity controls. So this doesn't, there's not like a lot of perfect examples of this. There are some kind of indirect ones, like where they give like pollution permits and things like that. But a common one where we see quantity controls It's kind of in the news a little bit right now, or at least I've heard it mentioned a little, kind of closely related to tariffs. What do we do sometimes to other countries? If we're buying a lot of their goods, we might impose an import quota, right? So some allow, say, any more than 500 automobiles from this country to come into our country, right? So a lot of the times these quotas are used in like not domestic markets, but foreign markets, right? So if I impose a quota, it's going to have the same impacts as these price controls did. It's just going to limit the quantity. So what is that going to create? Well, we no longer see any of these units in the market. So what does this represent? Deadweight loss. So the only kind of question I would ask you in relationship to quotas is identify deadweight loss, or kind of what is the reduction in quantity we have. The reason why I won't ask you about producer or consumer surplus, you could still think about what total surplus exists here. So the total surplus that exists here would still be all of this area, right? Now, the reason why I won't ask you to break it down to producer consumer surplus, and I believe the book does tell you that after a quota, the new price in this market will be up here. Right? But that's not quite technically correct. It often is, right? Because think about it, if the quantity is here, these companies would be willing to take a price as low as this. Consumers would be willing to pay as high of a price as this. Any value in between here, we would actually both agree on. Now, there might be some bargaining, and there might be some back and forth, but really any price in that range is below what consumers are willing to pay and above what above what producers are willing to take. So really the price could fall anywhere in this range. Now, the reason why the book gives you the rule of that the price ends up being up here, where that quantity, that quota would hit the demand curve, is because more often than not, who likely has more bargaining power in markets? Consumers or producers? Well, you might think it's consumers because there's a lot of them, but the fact that there's a lot of them actually gives each individual less power. Most markets, there's not a large number of firms. There's only a couple firms, so they're going to have more market power and a little bit more. So generally, we see the prices be closer to that point, but it's not a guarantee. So because I don't really not like that part of the book, I'm not going to ask you about producer to consumer surplus with quotas. All I want you to know with quotas is they cause this deadweight loss and they help us restrict, and they can restrict quantity. Okay. So nothing too terrible there, I don't think. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So the next thing that we're going to talk about. We'll see. Hopefully the audio. Let me see. I'll double check it. Test. Okay, it's working. All right. So we're talking about the labor market, right? $15 minimum wage causes unemployment, right? Yeah, if you keep your job, right, that's great, but a lot of people don't keep their job. And we're not going to talk about efficiency wages today. I thought we might have time, but we're not going to. I want to make sure we have time for other stuff. I also don't want this getting in our way, so we're going to move this down here. So the next thing that we're going to talk about are taxes. Okay? So we're specifically going to focus on taxes on producers, or what we call excise taxes. Now, there are other taxes like a sales tax, right? Or income taxes, or all these other things. We're solely going to think about a tax that is paid when you produce something. Well, I'll give you a glimpse into what happens if we're like a sales tax, and it's really like the same thing. But based off what we've already talked about, and also to simplify the material a little bit, I'm just going to focus on taxes on producers. So we've got all these taxes. Why do we pay taxes? What's generated by taxes? Well, who does the taxes go to? The government, right? So they can buy all the things, supposedly, right? They do themselves. Right? So we've got all these taxes. We're also going to, at the very end, think about who do these taxes hurt? So we're going to talk about something called tax incidence, right? Do these taxes hurt producers or consumers more? So even though I'm imposing the tax on the producer, does it hurt the consumer or the producer more or less, right? So here's like a very dumb, easy example before we get to like some graphs. Let's say David is willing to pay, and I think I had a typo in the slides I posted, so I've corrected it here. I'll re-upload the slides after class. I forgot a 1 somewhere, so we'll see. I'll mention where that's at. So let's say there's a used car, and David's willing to pay $11,000 for it. Matt's trying to sell it. He's willing to sell it for anything over $10,000. Can they come to some agreement? Yeah, any price in that range, they both would be okay with, right? Call it $10,500. They'd both be like, oh, I would have paid $11,000. Oh, I would have sold it for $10,000. We're both better off. Okay. So what if instead, this is another thing, I try not to be upset, like crotchety old man, but like when you buy a new car, you pay taxes on it. And then when that car is sold as a used car, guess what happens? You gotta pay taxes. You already paid tax. That's like if I went to the store and bought like an Apple, like I gotta pay taxes then if I sell some, like it's ridiculous, right? But that's the way the world works, right? So you got these used cars, there's a sales tax that you would have to pay on it. So let's say we had this wild sales tax just to kind of make the numbers work out nice. And I had to pay 50%. Well, even if Matt's feeling really nice, he's like, you know, I like you, David. I'm going to sell the car here. I was willing to sell it for $10,000. I'm not even going to haggle with you. I'll sell it to you for $10,000. David's like, great. I would have paid $11,000. The problem is when he now buys it from Matt, he has to pay Matt $10,000 plus this additional sales tax. So what's the additional sales tax? If it was 15%, another $1,500. So what is the total price now to David? He's got to give Matt $10,000. He's got to give the government $1,500. So what's the total price to him? $11,500. Was he willing to pay that much? No. So what's now going to happen? Is he going to want to buy that used car? No. So what did this tax do? It stopped the transaction. This should sound similar to what we were just talking about. Price ceilings, price floors, quotas, they're all going to do what the quantity? Restrict or reduce it. What are taxes you think going to do? Restrict it, right? So it's going to be very similar. We can get similar implications of restrictions of quantity in different markets, but through using taxes. And this is just a very base example of it. So we can think about a different example where I think I did cigarettes here. I think I'm going to draw this out first and we'll revisit this. I think that there's some things. I like my slides, but I think sometimes it's worthwhile building this out. There's a couple things I want to point out along the way. So and I think it's useful for you guys to take notes on this because in writing this down and paying attention, it's going to be better than if you're just kind of going through slides. You can zone out a little bit easier, right? So I'm doing this for you. So let's say we started out, here was our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Yeah. The government then comes in and imposes a tax on the producers. So we actually already talked about this. What is like, if I tax the production of something, what am I essentially doing? We said for firms, I'm raising their what? Well, if let's say I'm producing a gallon of gas and the government comes in and taxes the production of it. It costs me the same amount to produce that same gallon of gas plus this additional cost. So if I have increased input costs, what's going to shift here? Supply. What's it going to do? Decrease or increase? So if I've increased input costs, supply will decrease, right? So what would a supply decrease do? So the supply curve plus the tax, I've increased the cost. How much have I increased the cost by? Well, what would the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the tax? What's the difference between the two? The value of the tax, right? That's what shifted it. So if I tax this good, I'm going to shift supply. Where's the new price of this good? Well, when we were identifying equilibrium prices, we were kind of glossing over some stuff in earlier chapters. We might think, okay, here's the new equilibrium price. we're going to kind of differentiate this a little bit. This is what we're going to say is the price that consumers would pay. So yes, it's the sticker price we would see. So like if you go to the gas station, some popular taxes that are on producers, gasoline taxes, oil taxes, alcohol, tobacco, a lot of sin taxes. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But this is the sticker price you would see that you'd have to pay as the consumer. What does the seller get to keep? Well, if you hand over, I think the example I use is cigarettes on the slides. If I have to hand over $4.50 for a pack of cigarettes, but the tax on each one was $1, how much does the producer actually keep? Only $3.50. So the price the consumer pays, how much does the seller actually get to keep? Whatever that amount is, minus the value of the tax. What's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax? The value of the tax. So notice, if the price the consumer pays is the price the seller keeps plus the tax, another way of writing that, the price the consumer pays minus the tax is the price that the seller gets to keep. Okay. So with taxes, what's true about the price that consumers pay? It's going to be higher than before. What's true about the price that sellers get to keep? It's going to be lower than before. So what's going to happen, do you think, to producer and consumer surplus? If consumers are paying higher prices, producers are keeping less money. And where's the new equilibrium quantity after this tax? It's going to be lower. What do you think happens to producer and consumer surplus? They're both going to go down. So let's think about what producer and consumer surplus are. So consumer surplus, marginal benefits minus the marginal cost to consumers. What's their marginal benefit? The demand curve. What's their marginal cost? It's the price they pay. So the price that the consumer pays is now up here. So where is consumer surplus? Well, it used to be this entire triangle, right? So it's went down by quite a bit, right? Consumers lost out on all of this surplus after the tax. What is producer surplus? Once again, it's the difference between marginal benefits and the marginal cost of producers. What is their marginal benefit? The price they get to keep, right? The price the sellers get to keep. What's their marginal costs? That's represented by the original supply curve. So where would producer surplus be here? The area below the price they get to keep, but above their supply curve. What was it before? Well, the price was way up here, the old equilibrium price. Consumers and producers are both going to lose out on a lot of surplus when we have taxes. Any questions on this before I keep moving here? What is happening to quantity with this tax? Quantity is going, so just like with all the other price controls, where's our deadweight loss coming from? It's coming from the fact that we are no longer seeing any of these units in the market. So what would the loss of total surplus be? That difference between our original supply and demand curves for all those units that are no longer being produced. Right? So we can still identify our deadweight loss. So I could get to the same quantity using price floors, ceilings, or taxes. Okay. Any questions on anything there before I keep moving? Okay. So I've got one shape that I haven't done anything with yet. This big rectangle in the middle. Okay. So let's think about what is the height of this rectangle? So what would the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax be? That's just the value of the tax. Right? That was the difference in between these lines. So the height of this rectangle is the value of the tax. What's the base of this rectangle? Or what's the width? It goes from 0 to the quantity sold after the tax. If I take the quantity that's being sold after the tax and I multiply it by the value of the tax, what does that represent? This is how much money is going to the government for every unit. This is the number of units being produced and sold. So if I multiply those two together, that would represent the total amount of money going to the government, or what we would call tax revenue, right? That's all the area of this rectangle represents. The height will always be the value of the tax. The width of this will always be the quantity sold after the tax. So this is going to represent our tax revenue. So what do you notice about tax revenue? Some of it is coming from what used to be producer surplus, and some of it is coming from what used to be consumer surplus. So it's going to hurt both individuals, right? Both parties, both groups. Any questions on anything here before we keep moving? Okay. So I want to make sure we have 20 minutes left. Okay. Where are we at in time? All right, perfect. So I don't know. I've got kind of another way of just thinking about this. So let's say I had cigarettes, current equilibrium was $4, right? What would producer and consumer surplus be? Once again, non-technical way, consumer surplus on top, producer surplus on the bottom. Or we're thinking about the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs of both individuals. After this tax, we said what happens? Well, the new price consumers pay is going to be higher, $4.50. The seller gets to only keep that minus the tax. So here, what would the value of my tax be? $1, right? That's the difference between these supply curves. We then kind of identified consumer and producer surplus, tax revenue, and our deadweight loss, right? So we already did all of this. I wanted to kind of go through just quickly because I'm not going to ask you questions on this. But you would get the exact same effects if I impose the tax on producers or I imposed it on consumers. So let's say instead of these like cigarette taxes, because most cigarette taxes are imposed on the producers of the good. Let's say instead we made like a sales tax so that it's paid when you like the sticker price you see, you pay an additional tax when you go to buy it. Okay? I think I know that this is how like Michigan, Illinois, this is how they do marijuana taxes. It's not on producers, it's on consumers. So like you see a sticker price, not that I've ever went and bought anything there. But right, when you go and buy it, like you see the sticker price and then you see on the receipt sales tax, but then also this additional tax, right? So they impose it on consumers. So my family was in Michigan, so it wasn't illegal, all right? But if I were to impose this on consumers, I'm not going to be shifting supply, right? Because if I impose a tax on consumers, what am I doing? I'm taking whatever their marginal benefit was before and I'm lowering. So I'd actually get this decrease in demand, which is going to do what? Well, it's going to push the sticker price, the price that's paid in the store is going to be lower. So the price that sellers keep is going to be lower, but how much money do I have to pay? Well, whatever the sticker price is, plus this additional tax that shows up on the receipt, right? So now the price the consumer pay will be the price you see in the store, plus the tax the consumer has to pay. So it just works through different mediums. You still end up with that same $1 tax would decrease the quantity to the same amount. It would still result in the same price sellers keep and consumers pay, and then still result in the exact same implications on everybody's surplus. So it doesn't matter who I tax, consumers or producers, we get the exact same effects, as long as the value of the tax is the same. But just to keep it simple and easier, and also I think it's easy to think about taxes on producers like as additional costs, I'll only ever give you models and visuals where we're thinking about taxing producers, okay? But in practice, we see consumers also being taxed. Like that's a sales tax. That's what that, you know. Okay, I kind of already went through this, so I'll skip these slides a little bit. Well, will I? Well, okay, I got a little bit of time. I'll go through this just to another visual. So I just want to reiterate this before I kind of have you guys do some work. So before I have a tax, consumer surplus on top, A, B, and E, producer surplus on the bottom, C, D, and F. So I just really want to kind of make the case here. When I have this tax and it pushes the price consumers pay higher and the sellers keep lower, consumer surplus goes down, what did we lose out on? Areas B and E. So what does area E represent? So that's going to be deadweight loss that came from consumers. Right? What does area B represent? That's going to be a loss of consumer surplus. But if I now think about after this tax, what does this area of B and C represent? That was our tax revenue. So area B is what used to be consumer surplus that is now tax revenue. Now, area E is what used to be consumer surplus that is now part of deadweight loss. It's just loss, right? The quantity in the market is now lower. We're losing out on this surplus. Those units are no longer being produced and sold in the market. Now, for producers, we said their surplus was C, F, and D. After this tax, producer surplus is only this lower area D. So what does C represent? That is now tax revenue that came from producers. F would represent deadweight loss that came from producers. Now, we'll start talking about tax incidence, right? So you can kind of think about when I'm generating all this tax revenue, who is mostly paying? So B and C here, I kind of drew out, and I think the numbers I used in the cigarette tax example, it impacted both evenly. It doesn't have to be the case. In fact, consumers could be hurt by a tax more than the producers. And I'll kind of go through some examples of how in a second. But before we talk about tax incidence, I've got a quiz that I want you guys to work through. So get that pulled open. I think I've got it set to be due here at 10:30. So we won't take the full 13 minutes. I'll give you guys about 10 minutes to work with the people around you. I'm going to give you the answer to the fourth question because we haven't covered it, but it'll be good to kind of go back and review. So you'll be working on the first three. Oops. And then the fourth one, everyone should get right. I'm telling you what the correct answer is right here. After about 10 minutes, I'll kind of review the other ones with you. I also wanted to mention something here. So late quizzes are what? Zeros. So I didn't realize in the grade book it was showing them to you as late. They were counting as zeros towards your grade. I now make them so they're displaying to you as a zero. So anytime you turn something in late, it's a zero in the grade book, right? So I think before it was just telling you it was late and not counting it towards your grade. I want to make it a little more transparent. I'll now have those kind of display as zeros to you. Okay. But take the next 10 minutes, talk to the people around you, work on those first three questions that are related to taxes. And then I'm giving you this fourth one, which is related to subsidies, which we won't quite get to, I don't think, today, but we'll pick up on Tuesday class. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So I'm feeling nice. Also, supposed to be 300 people here. Not today. So make the due date on this a little bit early in case people are trying to game the system and not do these while being physically present in class. I'll give you guys kind of work through these. So as long as you're paying an ounce of attention today, should be easy points, right? So just a couple things, even additional to the questions here. If I gave you this visual, why do you know? I think I told you the problem, the value of the tax is 25. How could you find that? What's the value of the tax visual here? Just the difference between our supply curve and our supply curve plus the tax at any quantity. So I can use any quantity. I can use 35 here. And I've got a dashed line. The marginal cost of that 35th unit must be what? 45. The marginal cost plus the tax is 70. So what must the value of the tax have been? 45 steps, 70 minus 45 is $25. Now, I would also say another easy way to do this. Look over here at the intercept. The intercept goes from 10 to 35. What's the value of the tax? 25, the difference between those two. So even if I didn't tell you the value of the tax, you can identify it here from this visual. Okay. I think the actual question was, what is producer surplus? So what is the price that consumers will pay after this tax? So even if the tax is imposed on producers, shifts our supply curve, what's the price that consumers will now pay? It's essentially our new equilibrium point of $70. But what do sellers get to keep? When I hand over $70, do they keep all of that? No, they have to pay how much to the government? We just talked about. What was the value of the tax? $25. So they don't keep 70, they only get to keep 45. So we've got $45 being kind of the new price that sellers get to keep. If I want to calculate producer surplus, the marginal benefit to producers will be the price they keep. The difference between that and their marginal cost represented by their supply curve. So here, what's the area of this triangle? Looks like it's what, 35 times a half. So I'm just looking at a grid line here. Hopefully we can identify kind of what the height and the base and height of the triangle are. Should give us that 612. Okay. So 35 times a half gives us that producer surplus. Okay. Are there any questions on that? I guarantee you'll see something like this on the quiz and likely on the exam, right? So what if I wanted to know about tax revenue? Well, I don't want to edit this. So if I had the same example, well, I know the value of the tax. In fact, if I don't really want to know about this, like I could have not given you this visual. Well, let's say that I left off the y-axis values. But you didn't have them. But you know the value of the tax I told you was 25. How could you find tax revenue? Well, what would tax revenue be? It's just the value of the tax times the number of units or the quantity after the tax. What is the quantity after the tax? 35. So 35 times 25 should give me tax revenue. Now, if I have the visual and I don't even know the value of the tax, what will the height of this rectangle always be? Well, it's the difference between the supply curve with the tax and the supply curve. So the height would always be the tax. So what? 25 times 35 should give me that 875. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So on all of these, hopefully this is a not technical way of remembering it. And it's actually going to be a little bit easier for you guys because I'm not going to do subsidies today. I'm going to hold off to do them on Tuesday because I think it's worth spending a little bit more time on. And I want to also expect you to know it, so I don't want to rush through it. Everything we've talked about today, quotas, price ceilings, price floors, taxes. What is deadweight loss? It's always a triangle that is pointing to the right. It's always that surplus that's lost from the fact that we are no longer at that equilibrium quantity. We're now at a lower quantity. So the total surplus loss is the area in between my supply. I don't know why this is floating down here. My supply and demand curve. So it should be all of this surplus here, right? It's always, in all of these things, it's always going to be that little triangle that points to the right. That is not a technical way of remembering it, but it's an easy kind of way to visually identify it. Right? So I'm no longer seeing these 15 units produced. The difference between my supply and demand curve here, so the height of that triangle is, notice, when it comes to deadweight loss, what is the height of that triangle of deadweight loss always going to be? What is it here? The value of the tax. And then what is the base of that triangle? What would this represent? The quantity lost, right? The number of units we're no longer seeing sold. They don't always be the case, right? So here we saw the quantity go down by 15. The tax is 25. 15 times 25 times a half should give us that 187.5. And then the answer to the fourth one is just this producer surplus will decrease. We haven't talked about subsidies yet. We'll kind of save that for Tuesday. But I want you to have this question if you're going back to review later on. We'll eventually, I'll expect you to know subsidies for the next week. Any questions on any of those questions? Right? Want further explanation there? Yeah.
These types of questions on the exam, should they have a graph?
A lot of them. There'll be a lot more graphs probably on the second midterm than there were on the first. But yeah, for something like this, you would probably be getting a graph. They'll probably like use the graph for the next 4 questions or something like that. All right. So I had it set, I think, to be 10:30. So make sure you're getting kind of those answers in submitted, and we'll kind of go back and finish up material for the rest of class. Okay. So get those on submitted for 10:30. Should be good. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of jump back into material here? Yeah. So number 1. So if I want producer surplus, we said after the tax, the new price that consumers pay will be 70. The price the seller gets to keep will be that minus the value of the tax, so only 35. So producer surplus was just this area below their marginal benefit or the price they get to keep, but above their supply curve. So the height of that triangle, 35, base was 35, 35 times 35 times a half. Okay. Any other questions before we kind of jump back into things here? So the next thing we're going to talk about is tax incidence. So there's different ways of thinking about this. The first way kind of uses what we've already talked about. So, we talked about this like relationship with the price the consumer pays is the price that the seller gets to keep plus the tax, or the price the seller keeps is the price the consumer pays minus the tax. So we got to think about how much more, right, per unit is the consumer going to pay, and how much less per unit is the seller going to keep. Which one of those differences is larger? That's who's going to bear more of the burden. So I'll give you some values so we can kind of think about it, right? So let's say I had gasoline market as a, what? $1 tax here. And after the tax, the old equilibrium price is $1.50. The new price that consumers pay is going to be $2.25. The new price sellers keep is $1.25. Now, if I were to go through, calculate these producer consumer surplus values, I could figure out whether or not producer consumer surplus went up or down and which one went up or down more. But I can also do that from simply looking at these prices. Okay? So if I think about this, how much less per unit are producers getting to keep after this tax? Before, they were getting $1.50 per unit. After the tax, what are they getting? $1.25. So each unit they're making how much less? 25 cents. And they're seeing a reduction in quantity of 2 units. Excuse me. For consumers, how much more are they paying per unit? Well, they were paying $1.50. They're now paying $2.25. So how much more are they paying per unit? 75 cents. And they're going to see the same reduction in quantity. So both parties, consumers and producers, see the same impacts on quantity, but per unit prices, the change in what sellers get to keep, it only went down by 25 cents. Consumers had to pay 75 cents more. Notice, what do those two add up to? The value of this $1 tax. So who's paying more of the tax? Consumers, right? They're paying 75 cents more, while sellers or producers are only keeping 25 cents less. So the difference between the old equilibrium price and the new price that the consumer and seller get to pay and keep, that'll tell you something about who's bearing more of the burden of this tax, or what we call the tax incidence. Okay. So you can look at these prices, right? You can also use something we've already talked about, which is elasticities. So I always set this example up this way. Let's say, I don't know, me and someone else are standing on Kirkwood and there's a bus coming at us, right? Well, for whatever reason, let's say like there's not traction, it's really slippery out. And the only way I can get out of the way is if I push off the other person so that they hit the bus. And the only way they can get out of the way is if they push off the person, off of me to get. Who is going to bear more of the burden of that bus? Whoever is less responsive. Well, what is being less responsive? Inelastic. So if I'm more elastic, I can avoid the burden of that bus. If I'm not, I'm underneath it, right? It's the same idea with taxes. Whoever is more inelastic is going to bear more of the burden. They're not responding, because what did the tax do? We just talked about. It's changing the price that consumers get to have to pay and that sellers get to keep. So if I'm not responsive to these price changes, am I going to bear more or less of the burden? I'm going to bear more. What does being less responsive mean? It's being more inelastic. Okay. So here I've got just some example. And I wanted to change this second one. So let's say I had an example, and it can be that we're both elastic. So here I have an example where both supply and demand are elastic, right? They're above 1. But who is more inelastic? Whoever is closer to 0. So here, who would be more inelastic? Consumers or producers? Producers. So if they're more inelastic, who's going to bear more of the burden of that tax? Or whose surplus is going to go down by more? The producers. They're going to pay a larger percentage of that tax. If we go back to my earlier example, who must have been more inelastic here? Who is bearing more of the burden of the tax? Consumers. So it must be that their elasticity is actually lower than producers, right? They were more inelastic. What if I go all the way back to my cigarette example? This one's kind of weird. So $4, $4.50, $4 to $3.50. So they're both bearing the burden equally, right? So they would have what? In terms of elasticities, if they're bearing the burden equally, their elasticities would have to be exactly the same, right? Which, does that happen in practice? Probably not, right? Exactly the same would be very rare. And then the exact opposite is true. If I had an example, also to make the point, let's say this was 0.5 and 0.3. So both consumers and producers are both inelastic. Even if they're both inelastic, who's going to bear more of the burden? Whoever is more inelastic. So if this instead of 1.3 and 2.5, let's say this was 0.3 and 0.5, it would still be that consumers are more inelastic, and so they're going to bear more of the burden. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Yes.
In the case that a curve receives like 50 cents less for the machine that was third base 50 cents more, there could be a 30 change in percentage change.
Yeah, so if you're just, so you're saying if I compare the prices and who's paying more of it, think about it like this. So if I'm just comparing with that, yeah, I get what you're getting at. So but you're looking at the prices, you haven't factored the percent change to the quantity yet. So the percent change in price, you're not looking at percent change in price there, right? You're just looking at the change, but you're not dividing it by a percentage change in quantity. So it's just a different way of measuring who's going to bear more of the burden. They're not going to tell you, like, you can't come up with an exact value of how much of the burden based off the elasticity, but you can come up with like a directional change. Does that make sense? Like, I can say who's going to bear more of the burden. I can't say like what the value, the entire value of that's going to be. All right. Think of it as like it's two separate indicators of who's going to bear more of the burden, but they wouldn't allow you to calculate exactly what percent of the burden is what they're going to bear. Does that make more sense? It's a good question. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. Just another way of thinking about this. So this was like the earlier example that we had. It could be, so if I had something like this, this would be an example where what happened to producer and consumer surplus? They both started out the same and they both went down by the same amount. So this would represent a tax incidence where both individuals are bearing the burden equally, right? So you can also look at how much producer and consumer surplus changed by. Whoever's surplus went down more, they're bearing more of the burden, right? And that's what these indicators of elasticity would tell us, like who's going to have that greater loss of surplus. Doesn't tell you what the value of that surplus loss will be, just tells us that it is greater. Okay? So to kind of make this point of this relationship between elasticities, I want to do like the extreme, and it also kind of helps us think about the final thing we'll talk about. Okay. So let's say I had perfectly inelastic demand. So first of all, what would that look like? So this is where this class builds on itself. Yeah, someone's holding their hand up. To be vertical. Actually, technically the arrow should be pointing down, but right, it's a vertical demand curve. So if there are no taxes, my equilibrium quantity and price would be right here. Where would my producer surplus be? What is the marginal benefit to producers? Price. What's their marginal costs? The supply curve. So here is my producer surplus. Where's consumer surplus? Well, this one gets kind of weird. What's the marginal benefit of consumers? The demand curve. So it's like the area below the demand curve. It's vertical, so it gets kind of weird here. But above their cost, which is the price. So consumer surplus, if I have perfectly inelastic demand, is huge. Right? So think about like something that's very perfectly inelastic. Think about like drug users, right? Their demand is very, very, very inelastic. If it was perfectly inelastic and someone comes in and is like, you know what? Let's tax these, like tax the drugs, tax the hell out of them, right? Because what should taxes do? We've talked about like price ceilings and floors. It should do what to quantity? Restrict it. The problem is, I don't have enough colors. The problem is, if I tax this good and demand is perfectly inelastic, what's happened to the quantity after the tax? It's the exact same. People are completely unresponsive. So the tax changed the price, people kept buying the same amount. Now, inherently, we know if they're perfectly inelastic, who's going to be more inelastic, consumers or producers? If consumers are perfectly inelastic, it has to be consumers. So they're going to bear more of the burden of the tax. If they're perfectly inelastic, what ends up happening? Here's the new price that consumers pay. What's the price that sellers get to keep? Same as the old equilibrium. So this is to their indicators. How much of the burden are producers bearing here? They're making the exact same amount per unit. What's happening to consumers? All of this surplus, right? That is now tax revenue. What did it used to be? It used to be consumer surplus. So if it's perfectly inelastic demand, who bears the entire burden of the tax? Consumers, right? You'll also notice, what is deadweight loss here? So we said usually deadweight loss comes from the fact that we're seeing a reduction in the units. So what's deadweight loss? Yep. If we had perfectly inelastic demand, deadweight loss is 0, right? So, a lot of the times, these things are referenced like with I use drugs and like cigarettes and things, like sin taxes. Why does the government like to put taxes on sinful things? What is probably true about demand for most sinful things? Very inelastic. So what can I do? I don't cause a lot of deadweight loss. What can I generate a lot of? Tax revenue, right? Because people keep buying the same amount. So I don't know, my words, my wife helps me come up with my words of learning. So this one's what? Sin tax is proof that the government is just your mom charging you for your bad decisions, right? All these sin taxes on inelastic goods, it sounds politically good, like, oh, they're going to help reduce the number of drugs being used if we make the cost higher. If demand is inelastic, what happens? People keep using the same amount and the government just takes surplus. That was like was it this class where somebody asked me about drugs last? Yeah, right? All the government's doing is taking surplus away from people using drugs and turning it into tax revenue. Is the government having surplus better than drug users? It's a philosophical question. I would argue government having surplus is worse than any one of us, as citizens having, right?
So what did legalize those drugs and even like tax more insane because the government will benefit?
If you're just trying to generate tax revenue, what do you want to do? What do you want to tax? So that's the government might put sin taxes because it's like, oh, we'll reduce the quantity. Why do they actually like to tax things like alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs? Because they can generate a lot of tax revenues. They know those products are inelastic. They're going to be able to generate a lot of tax revenue. I guess I shouldn't put my thoughts about, well, I don't know exactly why they're doing things. I can assume and guess that's why they're doing it, right? Based off those principles. Okay. So kind of related to this idea, I want to tax these perfectly inelastic goods. I also want to make sure nothing is truly perfectly inelastic, right? So I kind of already drew this out for us here. If they're perfectly inelastic, the whole burden falls on consumers. So let's say I just had some regular kind of supply and demand, not perfectly elastic or inelastic. There's also going to be this trade-off between I might be able to impose a moderate, like a very small tax. So what's that going to do? I haven't shifted supply much. So what's going to happen to the reduction in quantity? It's going to be relatively small, which means my deadweight loss, it's coming from the reduction in quantity. So it's going to be pretty small. Now, there's still a lot of units being sold. So even though the tax was small, if the equilibrium quantity in the market is 100 and the tax is $1, I can generate $100. Well, let's say instead I increase that tax to $2. Well, the problem is that's going to cause a greater reduction in quantity. So let's say if I increase the tax from $1 to $2, now I only see in the market, I don't know, let's say 25 units. Well, what's the total tax revenue? 2 times 25 would be 50. So actually increasing the tax doesn't guarantee I can increase tax revenue. Because before it was only $1, yeah, I was making a very small amount on each unit, but I wasn't impacting the number of units in the market by much. So 1 times 100, I was still generating $100 of tax revenue. Eventually, as I start to increase this tax, the deadweight loss is getting larger and larger. And what's happening to my tax revenue? Well, yeah, I'm making more per unit, But eventually what happens if I keep increasing this supply curve with a higher and higher tax, this one doesn't quite hit it, but I mean, I'm driving that quantity closer and closer to what? If I have a tax high enough, what happens to the quantity? If it's zero, what would my tax revenue be? What's the deadweight loss of the entire market? So the size of the tax, as I increase it, it's going to cause deadweight loss to get higher and higher. And eventually my tax revenue is going to be becoming lower and lower. Now, there is something related to like tax revenues and elasticities we won't dive into in this class. So there is like an optimal point to set it. But in general, all I want you to know is this principle that as I kind of impose a larger and larger tax, what's eventually going to happen? That deadweight loss is going to grow, and that tax revenue is going to get closer and closer to zero. In fact, what's like here's a way to think about it. What's essentially a tax that it's not money? Well, I can think if I impose like a tax on someone, it could be amount of money they hand over. What could I also use to put a huge cost onto someone's life? If I want to make them not use drugs, instead of making them pay for legal drugs, if they use illegal drugs, I will throw them in. It's a huge tax. I mean, essentially, right? It's a huge cost that you're going to pay. We don't think of it that way, but essentially making things illegal where you'll go to jail. What have I done? I've just imposed a tax that should drive that client to zero. Now we get some weird things if we have like perfectly inelastic. Obviously, humans are humans, so we don't always make rational decisions in the moment when it comes to those things. But that's the idea. You could also always pose a high enough tax to push quantity to zero if you just throw people in jail for something, right? But here we're talking about excise taxes, actual taxes on units, but I sometimes like to make this connection to other things outside of just our typical goods. Okay. So the one thing we did not get to, well, here, I got 3 minutes. I think this is interesting. Real quick. I think it's a very interesting example of tax, right? So this idea of generating tax revenue. So Ireland had this brilliant idea. They wanted to get rid of plastic bags. So they started to impose these huge taxes on like grocery store, these like thin plastic bags. So what do you think ended up happening? Well, initially I thought like plastic bag use was going to fall by a lot, right? People aren't going to want to use these. What actually ended up happening is pollution actually went up. So if I'm at a grocery store and I have to pay like 15 cents for every one of these thin plastic bags, what might I invest in? My own reusable bag. What they found was that these reusable bags also tend to end up in the landfill. And you don't realize that those other paper bags are so thin. I forget what the equivalent is, but like there's like 50 of those like grocery store plastic bags in a reusable bag. So, you know, like the fact that people were using these reusable bags but still throwing them away, they end up actually still seeing a pretty large increase in you know, pollution. But the actual like thin plastic bag use fell by quite a bit because this is a pretty large tax, going from 0 to 15 cents essentially, right? Now the one thing we didn't cover, so only one bad word, taxes. We didn't get through subsidies. There will be a question on the quiz that asks you about subsidies. I'm going to, before it is released, edit it when I get back to my office, and I'm putting the correct answer in the question. So read the question carefully. You should get it correct. We'll cover it on Tuesday because subsidies are important. There's a very relevant example in the news I just heard about. But you're not expected to know it for this quiz. Okay. All right. Other than that, fun, safe weekend. I'll see you guys next week on Tuesday.